In other words, in the 1930s, 36, 39, the Arabs revolted against the British and against the Zionist enterprise and intended to essentially eliminate, kick out the Jewish community at the time, 400,000 Jews in Palestine. And this expulsionist thinking and activity, terrorism, a guerrilla attack, and so on, generated among the Jews an understanding that there was no solution to Arab enmity and Arab belligerence except to clear out the Arabs from their midst, from those areas which would become a Jewish state eventually. Some Zionist leaders adopted that. The second reason for it was, of course, what was happening in Europe during the 30s, which translated in the 1940s into the Holocaust. And that was that the Jews in Palestine, or the Jewish people, needed a safe haven. Europe's Jews needed a safe haven. And the Palestinian Arabs, because of their belligerence, were not allowing a safe haven in Palestine. They were killing Jews, and they were forcing the British to close the gates of Palestine to Jewish immigration to Palestine. So this meant that in order to create a safe haven, you cannot have an internal, if you like, fifth column or whatever you call it, inside the area of Palestine, which would become the Jewish state. You needed to transfer these Arabs out, otherwise there would be no safe haven and the Jews of Europe would have nowhere to go to. So I'm saying these two things, Arab belligerence and Nazi persecution essentially, led the Jews of the Zionist leaders to think also in terms of transfer, whereas before 1936, between 1880 and 1936, the traditional view of the Zionist leadership had been that there was room in the country for both peoples. They could coexist either together or even in separate states, but there would be no necessity to transfer anybody from Palestine. A Jewish majority, if it was obtained, would be obtained through immigration. But the conditions of the 30s changed the thinking among some of the Zionist leaders, as I say, including Ben-Gurion and Weizmann. This doesn't mean, and this is important to stress, that this was ever adopted, transfer thinking or a transfer policy was ever adopted by the Zionist movement. It was never adopted by the Zionist movement on the whole. It was never adopted by any major Zionist party, including the right-wing revisionist party. They never adopted or proposed or advocated transfer. But there was transfer thinking in the minds of the leaders, and this in 1948, when the Arabs attacked the Jewish community, was given in some way free rein, even though it wasn't also in 48 adopted as policy by the Jewish state or, in fact, the Jewish military forces. I'll get to that in a second. A second thing is that the population in Palestine, 1.3 million Arabs, by 1947, 600 and something thousand Jews, were thoroughly intermixed, especially in the areas which were designated by the United Nations in its partition resolution of November 47, thoroughly intermixed Jews and Arabs. In other words, along the roads between Tel Aviv and Haifa, Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, the Jordan Valley and so on, along each main road you had a Jewish village and Arab village, a Jewish village and Arab village, and in the main towns many of them were mixed, Jewish neighborhoods and Arab neighborhoods. What that meant when it translated into civil war, which the Arabs began at the end of 1947, they launched the war, it meant that to achieve victory, one of the sides, each side would really in the end have to clear out the other. If they wanted to safeguard the Jewish settlements, they would have to clear out the Arab settlements which were blocking the road and supplies to those Jewish settlements, and the same applied in the Arab and Jewish neighborhoods in the towns. If you wanted to win the war, the Arabs would have, if they wanted to win the war, they would have to kick out the Jews from these settlements along the roads and from the neighborhoods which threatened their neighborhoods in the towns, or vice versa. If the Jews wanted to win, they would have to clear out Arab settlements and Arab neighborhoods. And this is what happened. And the side which won the war is the side which did the clearing out. Expulsions, driving out, we'll get to that in a second, how it actually occurred. But the intermixing of the populations made victory impossible for either side without some form of displacement of population, large or not so large. Another major precondition for what happened, for the displacement of the 700,000 Arabs, was the weaknesses, the internal weaknesses of Arab society. Arab society fell apart in the course of the 1948 war. the war affected both sides. People were killed on both sides of the barricades. Houses were bombed, neighborhoods were shelled, but the Arab society fell apart. And it fell apart, and the Jewish society didn't, and that's why it survived. Arab society was weak because it had no solid internal government structures before 48. There was no democracy there, no elections, no real representative internal government. There were major fissures between Muslims and Christians, between townspeople and rural population, between townspeople and Bedouin. It was a very uncohesive society, which had been in fact driven by internal dispute and struggle by two major factions which controlled the politics of the internal Palestinian society, so-called Husseinis and Nashashibis, two coalitions of notable families which dominated the political arena, and they were at loggerheads through the 30s and 40s. When it came to war with the Jews in 47, 48, they could not come together, they did not come together, and essentially the opposition, the Nashashibi-led coalition which opposed the Husseini coalition which dominated politics by 47 in Arab Palestine, the Nashashibis stayed out of the fray against the Jews. They said, you want to fight the Jews? Fight the Jews. We're going to Lebanon. We're sitting in our homes in Jerusalem. We're not going to join the fight. So when they entered the war, Palestinian society was fragmented in a number of different ways and very weak. And when they suffered the hammer blows of war, they fell apart and people fled. First the leaders, the middle class, the upper class, and then the masses. A last precondition, which is important to understand, is that the war was fought from the Arab side, first by the Palestinian Arabs, and then by the Arab states, essentially as a zero-sum game. It wasn't a war for a little piece of somebody's territory, France and Germany fighting over Alsace-Lorraine. It was a war to the finish as seen from the Arab side. They're going to win the war, they will drive the Jews into the sea. This at least was how it was perceived by the Jews and perhaps many of the Arab participants. And that made the Jewish side, when it waged the war, when it began to counterattack after the initial Arab attacks, think in terms of a zero-sum game and think in terms of taking of not leaving wide margins for safety. There was no room for maneuver. You had to either win, which meant driving out the population in the end, or you would lose. As I say, this was essentially thrust upon the Jews by the Arab intentions as the Jews perceived them in conducting the war. One can divine four clear stages in the creation of the refugee problem. And they're important in order to understand how it happened and why it happened. The first stage lasted from the UN partition resolution of the 29th of November. The following day, Palestinian Arab militiamen began to attack the Jews in certain spots in Palestine. There wasn't a unified, comprehensive assault. There were attacks in different places which gradually escalated into a full-scale civil war.